My name is Elise, and the night I realized my marriage was already over, Nolan didn't yell, didn't slam a door, didn't even look angry. He just slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table and said, "Read the first page," and my stomach dropped before I even saw the word divorce. I'm 35, and I'd been married to Nolan for 8 years. And for most of that time, I told myself I was the one doing the hard work of modern love and learning old scripts, demanding equity, and teaching the kind of emotional intelligence nobody ever taught men. 3 years ago, I decided Nolan had started taking me for granted in that quiet, everyday way that makes a woman feel like she's slowly becoming the furniture. He'd come home from his engineering job expecting dinner, warmth, affectional, like I was a service package. He'd subscribed to one evening. Something in me hardened into a decision I was proud of at the time. I told myself it was boundaries, not punishment, and I stopped physical intimacy completely. No sex, no just this once, no letting him smooth things over with touch when he still wasn't seeing the real issue. I sat him down and said, "Nolan, intimacy isn't something you're entitled to because we're married. It requires emotional investment and real appreciation for what I carry." He stared at me like I'd changed the rules mid-game, and I kept going because I truly believed clarity was kindness. I told him about the mental load, the invisible labor, the constant planning that keeps a household running while everyone else thinks it runs on magic. I reminded him how I remembered birthdays, managed our calendar, planned holidays, tracked appointments, coordinated family events, and handled 100 little decisions that never counted as work because no one saw them. "Until you start treating me like an equal partner instead of a domestic default," I said, "things need to change." He tried to argue, and I shut it down calmly, because calm felt like strength. The first few months, Nolan kept trying to talk like he could troubleshoot the problem the way he troubleshot machines. "I don't get it," he said. "I work full-time. I do dishes. I listen when you talk about your day." I remember rolling my eyes because men love to list chores like they're proof of character. "It's not about tasks," I told him. "It's the power structure underneath your assumption that I'll always be available for your physical needs while you put minimal effort into understanding my emotional reality." His face reddened and he said, "That's not how I see you, Elise. Unfair is me carrying this marriage in my head for 8 years. I snapped, then steadied my voice like I was delivering a lesson. "You live here like a guest who occasionally does dishes, and you think that makes you a partner?" He stood there with his fists tight and asked, "So your solution is to cut off all physical connection how long?" I said, "Until you demonstrate genuine growth and appreciation, because I believed growth was measurable if you held the line." "This isn't about a deadline," I added. "It's about fundamental change." Months turned into a year, and our conversations became circles. We kept walking until we were dizzy. Nolan started calling it insane, started saying marriage doesn't work like this, started accusing me of holding the relationship hostage. I kept insisting it wasn't hostage-taking, it was boundaries, and that boundaries were necessary because women are taught to accommodate male entitlement until there's nothing left of them. He paced the living room one night like a trapped animal and said, "I've tried talking to you every day, and every conversation becomes a lecture about how terrible I am." He said, "You barely let me kiss you goodnight," and I said, "Physical touch without emotional intimacy is using someone's body." That's when his anger started showing up in ways I could point to and label. He punched the wall once, leaving a small hole, and I felt a grim satisfaction because now I had evidence. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," I told him. "Instead of listening and self-reflecting, you're getting aggressive and volatile. And that's why intimacy doesn't feel emotionally safe." He stormed out, and I told myself he was confronting his conditioning. I told myself discomfort meant progress. Year 2 got quieter, but it wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. Nolan stopped initiating touch entirely and started staying late at work. And when he was home, he felt like a man who learned silence was safer than speaking. I interpreted it as sulking, as emotional immaturity, as another attempt to regain control without doing the work. In the kitchen one morning, I said, "You're withdrawing, and that tells me you still don't understand the assignment." He slammed his mug down and said, "We're supposed to be partners. Elise, partners don't punish each other for imaginary crimes." I told him it wasn't imaginary, it was pattern recognition, and that he'd spent 8 years centered while I carried the burden of the relationship. He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language and said, "You keep saying equal, but you're the only judge here." He said, "You decide what counts as appreciation, what counts as emotional labor, what counts as growth, and I have no say, not even in my own marriage." I called him dramatic because I didn't know what else to call the panic rising in me. "The fact you experience equality as oppression tells me how privileged your old position was," I said, and I watched something in his eyes go dim. By year 3, Nolan barely spoke unless necessary. He'd come home, eat quietly, watch TV, and go to bed like a man ticking off survival steps. I tried to confront the silence because I needed him to engage, and I said, "This silent treatment is passive-aggressive, and if you want to discuss rebuilding our connection, I'm open." He looked up with dead eyes and said, "Discuss what? How I need to change more while you give me nothing." He said, "You've spent 3 years telling me I'm fundamentally flawed as a husband and a person, so what's left to discuss?" I told him his growth was what we needed to discuss, and I said, "I'm giving you the chance to become a better partner, and most women would have left instead of investing this much energy." He laughed like it physically hurt and said, "You call this investment? This is punishment for crimes you invented." He stood up so fast his chair fell back and said, "You decided I'm guilty of being male and married to you." I said, "Your anger is proving my point, because I couldn't stop myself from turning everything into evidence." That night, he finally said, "I'm done," and walked upstairs with a stillness that felt different, but I told myself it was just another cycle. A few weeks later, he wasn't angry anymore. He was calm, distant, almost polite. He said, "We need to talk tonight when you get home," and something in his tone tightened my chest, but I assumed he was finally ready to compromise. When I walked in, he was sitting at the table with papers spread out neatly, and he didn't look like a man preparing for a fight. He looked like a man who'd already left emotionally and was just finishing the paperwork. "What's all this?" I asked, and he said, "Read the first page." I flipped it, saw the heading, and felt the room tilt. "These are divorce papers," he said, and he said it like he was stating a fact, not declaring war. I actually laughed once because my brain refused to accept it. "You can't be serious," I said, and he replied, "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." I rushed around the table and said, "Nolan, wait, this is a reaction. You're overwhelmed. We can work through this." And he stepped back like my presence made him claustrophobic. "Work through what?" he asked. 3 more years of being told I'm terrible, 3 more years of being treated like a problem to fix, 3 more years of being punished for wanting my wife to love me." He spoke calmly, which made it worse, because calm meant he wasn't posturing. I told him he was mischaracterizing my boundaries, and he said, "I spent 3 years trying to understand what you wanted." He said he read the books, he tried therapy, he examined everything about himself, and that nothing was ever enough because the game was rigged. I snapped back that he was throwing away 8 years because he couldn't handle growth, and he said, "I haven't been allowed to be a partner." He said, "You turned me into a probationary tenant in my own marriage where every word was wrong and every action was evidence." I told him there was nothing impossible about respect and appreciation, and he said, "What about your behavior?" He asked me with about 3 years of withholding affection to control the relationship dynamic. He asked, "What about turning every conversation into a lecture?" He asked, "What about making him feel like a monster for wanting to feel loved?" I said, "I didn't withhold affection. I established boundaries for emotional safety." And he looked at me like I was proving his case in real time. "You made me feel emotionally unsafe every day," he said. "You criticized everything I did, questioned every motive I had, and turned our home into a place where I was constantly failing." I tried to take control by calling it a threat, a manipulation tactic, and I said, "I won't be intimidated into abandoning my principles." He stared at me for a long moment and said quietly, "You still don't get it." He said, "This isn't a negotiation and it isn't a threat. I don't want to work on our marriage anymore. I want out." The word out hit me like grief, but my pride turned it into argument, and I said marriage required perseverance and that he was running away from emotional responsibility. He shook his head and said, "I've been in therapy for 2 years, and my therapist helped me realize you don't want a partner, you want a project." I said that was unfair and that I wanted an equal, and he said, "You call it equal while you correct me like I'm a broken appliance." Then he did something that felt like a knife. He signed the papers right in front of me, quietly, one after another. I kept talking anyway, telling him leaving was the easy path, telling him he was choosing comfort over growth, and he finally looked up and said, "Do you hear yourself? I'm telling you I'm in pain and you're lecturing me?" He told me he loved me, that he wanted the relationship we used to have, that he wanted to come home to someone happy to see him. He said he wanted desire and partnership, not constant evaluation. I told him what he wanted was complacency, and he flinched like I'd slapped him with a word. He stood, held the signed papers, and said he was staying at his brother Adrian's place, and that lawyers would handle the rest. I ran after him, telling him he was making a mistake, and he paused at the door and said, "What have we built the last 3 years? Resentment, distance, walls, and a marriage where you judge and I fail." I called him selfish, and he turned back and said, "What about your agenda? What about you unilaterally changing everything and withholding love until I became who you wanted?" I stood in the doorway as he walked to his car and kept insisting this was victim mentality. that he was rewriting history to avoid accountability. He rolled down the window and finally let his voice crack. "My issue isn't emotional intimacy," he said. "My issue is being emotionally abused by someone who calls it education." Then he said the sentence that I replayed later in the quiet house. "I wasted 3 years trying to earn basic kindness from my own wife." He drove off, and I told myself he'd come back when he cooled down. I called and texted, offering reconciliation plans and counseling and new ground rules that might feel safer for him, and he never responded. A week later, Adrian answered his phone and said Nolan wanted all communication through lawyers. I tried to explain that Nolan was reacting to being challenged, and Adrian got quiet and said, "I watched my brother become a shell of himself." He said he'd listened to Nolan agonize that his own wife didn't want him, and he said he was proud Nolan finally stood up for himself. I told Adrian he didn't understand the context, that Nolan was presenting a one-sided story, and Adrian's voice hardened. "The only pattern I saw was you tearing him down," he said. "You had him convinced that being a normal husband made him some kind of oppressor, and that didn't grow him, it destroyed him." Then he hung up, and I felt fury because it was easier than shame. When the mediation paperwork arrived, I called a lawyer and tried to frame this as an emotional breakdown, and my lawyer said carefully, "If he's been unhappy for 3 years, this isn't sudden." At mediation, Nolan sat across from me, calm and resolved. And when reconciliation came up, he said, "There's no possibility of reconciliation." I tried to interrupt, tried to pull the conversation back into meaning and lessons, and he said, "I don't want guidelines, discussions, or educational opportunities. I want to end this marriage." In the parking lot, I begged for 5 minutes without lawyers, and he said, "What's happening is I filed for divorce and you can't accept it." I told him he'd regret it, that most women would have left instead of investing in his development, and he said, "You didn't invest in my development, you invested in your fantasy of who you wanted me to become." The divorce finalized 3 months later, and Nolan never wavered. He didn't beg or bargain or circle back for closure. He just signed and moved on like a man who'd finally escaped a room with no air. Alone in the house afterward, I told myself my familiar story that he chose comfort over growth, that he ran from accountability, that his fragile ego proved everything I'd been saying. But in the quiet, another thought kept showing up, no matter how hard I tried to intellectualize it away, and it wasn't a framework or a theory. It was a simple, brutal question that didn't care about my vocabulary. What if what I called boundaries felt like cruelty? And what if the moment he slid those papers across the table wasn't him refusing to grow? What if it was him finally choosing to survive?
If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.